Hi, this is another video on how to create a game like Clash of Clans. So in this video, I'm gonna fix a few problems, then we can continue with creating the functions to place our buildings on the grid. So I've already have the client and server project open. Let's go to the server project, and here in the data, this serialize and deserialize class, I like to make them async. So to do that, I'm just gonna add async to the start of the method. Let's do this for this one as well. And now the return type of this one is going to be task string. And the return type of this one is going to be task T. And now let's create the tasks for them. And now I'm just going to cut this code and paste it inside my task. And at the end, I am saying return await task. I'm gonna do the same thing for this one. Let's just copy this. And of course, the type is going to be task type T. And let's just cut these values to my task. And we need to only do this on the server side. We don't need to do this in the client side. And let's see where these functions are being called. Let me find the references. Only one reference. Let's go there. Here it is in the database, sync player data. So I'm simply saying a string player data equals to, and I'm gonna say await, and let me just copy this value and paste it here, and here I'm gonna write player data. So that's one problem down. Now if you remember, here in the server we commented this part of the code because C# doesn't have a definition for rect, but it does have a definition for rectangle. It is an struct within the system drawing. We can use that. So let's go back to our server, and up here I'm gonna say using system.drawing, and let's go back to the commented area and remove the comment, and instead of rect I'm just gonna say rectangle. So let me copy and paste it here, here, and here. And instead of overlap, it has a function called intersects with. It's basically doing the same thing as rect.overlap. And here, instead of current x, I'm just gonna say x and y. And here, for this one, we're gonna use the x and y that we just passed to this function. Here they are. And instead of return false, we're gonna say can place building equals to false. So this is it for the server. Let's go back to the client. Here, as you can see, we have a bunch of receivers for whenever we get a response from the server. So I've decided to only use packet for my game. I don't need to use receive long or receive a string or any other type of data receiver. I'm just gonna use packet. So I'm no longer needing the receive long. So we need to go to the server, and instead of sending that as a long, we're gonna send it as a packet. So let me collapse these things that we don't need for now. And here in the authenticate player, instead of doing TCP send long, which is the account ID, I'm going to create a new packet. And actually, let's get the requests enum from our client. Let's go to the player script. Here, if you remember, we created a request ID enum. I'm just gonna copy that and go to the server and terminal. Here on the data region, I'm just gonna paste it. Now here in the database, I'm just gonna say terminal dot request ID dot authenticate, and I'm gonna cast it at an integer. And here I'm going to also write the account ID, and I can simply say TCP send packet. And here in the client side, whenever we receive a packet, instead of switch ID, we can just say switch, and we're gonna say ID, and we're gonna cast this ID to request ID, and this way we can understand it better. Here in the case of 2, I'm just gonna cut this. It's going to be our build. I'm gonna paste it there, and we no longer need this switch statement. And for auth, we're just gonna use this TCP send. I'm gonna cut that and paste it here in the auth, but we need to get a long, which is our account ID. So we're gonna say long.account ID packet.read long, so we can do whatever we want with that, and we no longer need this received long. And let's remove that as well. So now we need to handle the situation in our sync request ID. If you take a look here, whenever we get an authentication response, we immediately going to send a request for sync. And let's go to the server and see what happens when we get that request here in the terminal, in the receive packet, and here actually in the receive string we're gonna get that. But as I mentioned, we're gonna move everything into the packet. We're no longer using the other kind of data type. So let's go to the receive packet and create a switch statement like we did on the client. And here I'm gonna cast the ID into request ID, and here it is. And the case of 3, which is our build, I'm just gonna cut everything, paste it here. So let me remove this switch statement. And we also have 2 receivers on receive string. The first one is this one for authentication, and the second one for syncing player data. And I'm gonna move them here and here. Let me cut that to the sync area. And the same thing for this one. And let me clear this. Here it is. Now we need to send these 2 requests from the client as packets. So here in the client, instead of doing it like this, I'm just gonna create a packet, and I'm gonna name it P because we already have a packet there, equals to new packet. I'm gonna write the first parameter to be our request ID. So let me cut that. My second parameter is going to be the device ID, which I have here. And instead of that, I'm just gonna send P. Also here in the connection response, whenever we send a request for authentication, we're gonna do the same thing. Instead of sending a string, I'm gonna send a packet. The first parameter is going to be request ID, and the other one is going to be device. I'm going to send the packet. So now it's been handled here. So whenever we send a sync request to our server, we can simply just read the string, which is going to be our device. Let's just copy and use it in our sync as well. Well, apparently we can use the name multiple times in the switch, so I'm just gonna create it up here. And here we go. So when we are receiving a sync request, we're gonna send that request to the database. Database is going to get the player data, then it's going to create a packet with the ID of 2, which is we need to cast that to an integer and say terminal dot request ID, sync. So we're gonna send a sync request to the client which contains a string, and that string is the serialized data of our player. So let's go back to the client. So here it is. I'm gonna say a string player data equals to packet.readString, and here I'm gonna say data.player and name it player class equals to data.deserialize. I'm gonna pass the player data, and it's gonna turn our string data to a class data. So apparently we have a name conflict here. I'm just gonna name this player sync data. And let's create a separate method for this. I'm just gonna say private void sync data, and it takes a data.player. So let's go up here in the sync data, we're gonna say player sync data, and that should do it. And here these values shouldn't be here. Let me just cut this. These are sync values. The build takes only an integer. Let me paste those here. We don't need those two. So whenever sync data gets called, our UI elements are going to be updated. And let's also check to see if there is any buildings in our player.buildings. If it not equals to null, and if the count is greater than 0, which means we have buildings. If you remember, we created a list of buildings in our grid. So let me close a bunch of these classes. Here it is, our build grid. And we created a list of buildings which are of type building. Let's go to this building class. And here our building has an ID. But we're not going to use that ID to identify the buildings on our grid. We're going to use the database ID. So for that, I'm just going to create another variable, and I'm gonna name it database ID, and it's going to be of type long. And also we are going to create a setter for it. Now let's go to the build grid and create a function to find a certain building by the database ID. So here I'm just gonna create a public building, and we're gonna say get building, and we're gonna pass a long, which is going to be the database ID of that building. At the end we're gonna return null, but here we're gonna loop through the buildings. And if we found a building with that ID, we're just gonna return that building. So here in the player script, if the player has buildings, we're gonna loop through them. So we're gonna say player buildings dot count. And also we're going to create a building class, which is going to be equals to UI main.instance.grid.getBuilding, and we're gonna pass player.buildings index of i.database ID. We say if the building is not equals to null, then we have that building already on the grid. We just need to update the values. Otherwise, we do not have that building on the grid, and we need to place it there. So here in the UI building, we've created a function to instantiate a building on the grid. Here it is, building equals to instantiate building prefabs in the UI main, and we pass a prefab index. But instead of this prefab index in the UI building, I think it's better to use the building global ID. So I'm gonna say ID, and it's going to be of type string. And let's go to our UI main building prefabs. Here it is. And we're just gonna create a function to get the prefab of a certain building. So let's say public building get building prefab, and we're gonna pass in a string which is going to be ID. At the end we're gonna return null, and we're gonna loop through the building prefabs. So we're gonna say building prefabs dot length So if the ID matches that, we're just gonna return that building prefab. Otherwise, we're just gonna return null. So here in the UI building, we're going to say building, and this is going to be prefab equals to UI main dot instance dot get building prefab, and we're gonna pass underline dot ID, and only if we found a prefab, then we're going to do the rest of the things we did here. Let me just cut all of that and paste it here. Do the same thing for those. And instead of this, we're just gonna pass the prefab. And if you remember, in the building, we created this mesh renderer called base area. Let's actually make that public. So here in the building, whenever we instantiate it, we're going to say building dot base area dot game object, and we're gonna set active to true. So I'm just gonna copy this part for now to my player. First, we're gonna find the prefab. The ID is going to be player dot buildings I dot ID, and once we found the ID, then we're going to instantiate it and then place it on the grid. So let me copy those. Let's go back and paste it here. We don't need the position actually, we can just pass vector 3 0, because this building dot place on the grid is going to set the position for us, and we already have a variable named building. So this one I'm just gonna name it B, also B and B here, and we're gonna set the base area to false because the building is placed. We don't need to show that green and red area under the building. And also the most important part, we need to say UI main dot instance dot grid dot buildings dot we're gonna add the B to this list. So far so good, I think. Yeah, let's play the server and see what we did until now. And now let's go to the client and let's double check the building IDs. Here the gold mine, the ID for it is gold mine. Let me copy this. We're gonna match that ID with the UI ID in our shop. Here in the buildings list, let me expand this. Viewport content UI building. Yes, this is actually our gold mine building. So let me just paste the ID for this one as well. And now after I save this, I'm gonna play it. Let's go to the shop, place a gold mine, and I'm gonna drag it around. Let's place it here. Okay, it says placed successfully. So let me close the client and play it one more time. Yes, there is a building, but it's on the wrong position. Let's check out why. Let's go back here. Oh, of course, we need to pass the X and Y on this place grid. So instead of that, we're going to say player dot buildings I, and we're gonna pass the X, the same thing for Y. One more thing we need to do after our confirm build has been clicked. So when this confirm gets clicked, it's going to send a packet to the server, and immediately after that, let me just call this cancel button. So that's that. This way it's just gonna remove that temporary building and all that UI elements. So after we successfully got a response to this request, which that response is going to be passed to the player here in the build, and after this building has been placed successfully, let's actually create a method. I'm going to say public void send sync request. We're gonna send a sync request. Let me copy that, paste it here, and we're gonna do the same thing here in the authentication. I'm just gonna paste it here and copy. Actually, let's cut all of that and bring it down here in our send sync request. So the server is still on. Let me play this client one more time. And as you can see, the building we placed is already there. Let's place another one. I'm gonna place it there. As you can see, we just got a message that there is no resources to build this building. Let's go check out the database. Let me go to the database admin. And here in my database, I'm gonna go to the server buildings. As you can see, the elixir cost is 500, and I've already placed this building. And if you remember in the previous video, I also placed another building, and two buildings together becomes 1000. So I consumed all my 1000 elixirs. So that works as well. First, let me go to the buildings and delete that building I've created in the previous video. This is that building. I'm just gonna delete that. This is the building we just created. And in the account, let me just give myself a little elixir. So now let's go back to the client. It's still playing. Go back to the shop and place a building. As you can see, if they overlap, it's gonna turn red. And we also need an option to check if the buildings are overlapping. We don't allow it to place it. Right now it just allowed it. So this is actually problematic. It indicates that the server is not detecting overlap the proper way. But first of all, let's handle the client side. Fortunately, the client side handles it properly. But here in the confirm, we also need to check another condition. Let's go to the building script, and here, if you remember, in the set base color, we created a function for it to check if the building can be placed on the grid or not. Let me just copy this. And I'm gonna bring that condition to my building here and say and. Let's paste it. If UI main instance grid can be placed, and we're gonna pass the building dot instance, which we just checked it is not null, and we're also going to pass this building dot instance dot current x and y. So this way we make sure if that area under the building is red, the confirm button is not gonna send the request. So here, let's check this out. I'm just gonna bring it there, and whenever I click this, it's not gonna pass the request. But if I place it here and click confirm, it's gonna place the building for me. But we also need to double check this on the server, because those two buildings that just got placed above each other should not happen. So let's go to the server and check out why. Here on the place building, let me take a look. First, we're going to check to see if the building is outside the bounds. And second, we're gonna check to see if we have a building overlap. This should have changed it to false. Let me actually add a break here as well. Well, everything looks fine. This should have worked, but I'm gonna look into this later, and if there is a problem, I'll find it and fix it in the next video. But for now, everything works the way we want it. So I'm gonna just go to my buildings table and remove that overlapping building that just created. It was the second building. Now let me start the server and check if the building was removed. Yeah, this is how it's done. So this is it. Now we have a system that we can place buildings on our grid. Hopefully in the next video, I'm gonna create a function to click on these buildings, select them, and be able to move them around and replace them on our grid. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you had any questions, feel free to ask me. Thank you for watching.